We're talking LA Chargers on the Our Football Network, Our Football YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in. Another off-season preview. This time, we welcome in our special guest, Alex Insdorf from the Chargers Wire. And you can catch him once a week with his podcast. And of course, we're going to have links in the description so you can check out how to find Alex, either in his articles, his podcasts, or his X account. How's it going, Alex?
Good. How are you doing this off season?
It's going. It's the off season. It's a lot of fun here at Our Lads. It's a lot going on. The draft. This is our busy season, so this is when things really start to kick in. Matter of fact, our Lads draft guide will come out, and this will be delivered. This is the 24 edition. The 25 edition will be available and distributed April the 7th. So make sure to order this out there. We'll have a link in the description for this as well. And this is also a great time of year. I know everybody's looking for mock drafts and transactions and who's doing what and where. How do the depth charts and rosters look? Well, check out the depth charts here at Our Lads, the best in the business. We update them daily. Tucker does a great job of it. So matter of fact, doing preview work research for the show, you still see Molden as a free agent for overthecap.com. But he is no longer a free agent designation on our depth chart. So just like that, he is just a regular guy in the LA Chargers defensive backfield. So anyway, this is why Alex is on here to help us to educate ourselves with one of the teams. And that team, the LA Chargers, are coming off a pretty good season, Alex. And I know we had a little opportunity to talk about it, but kind of disappointing the way it all ended, and injuries, and that really had a lot to do with it. But for the most part, it was a successful season.
Yeah, for the most part, successful season. The goal, I think, was just to be kind of better than last year, and then culturally dig out of the hole of the previous regime. And Jim Harbaugh was obviously very impressive. Jesse Minter was impressive, and I think they brought the roster together in a really effective way from where it was a year ago. I think there's still a lot to do as far as, getting on the tier of being a team like the Eagles, like the Chiefs, and what they need to add this offseason. But certainly a very good start.
Okay, now as far as what the team needs to do to improve, because again, there's a lot. The good news is there's ample cap space. So that's for sure. And we're going to talk about what this team needs to do to potentially spend that money on. And how's the draft capital?
Draft capital is pretty good. So right now they technically have 7 picks. Once comp picks are awarded in March, they will have 10.
Oh, okay.
Or at least that is where they're currently projected based off of free agents that left last year and getting to use. I think they have an extra 5th, an extra 6th, and an extra 7th round pick. So basically doubling up a lot of those late rounds, so you can add some depth there.
Okay, so let's get started with the free agents. I mentioned Molden, so he's like the first guy in. And let's start with the defense. What does that do to the secondary? Because I see here, Fulton's a free agent, Asante Samuel's a free agent. Maybe it's time for Tony Jefferson to re-retire. Marcus May is also a free agent. So tell us about the secondary. We'll start there.
Yeah, so I think what you see in the secondary right now is obviously they just re-signed Elijah Molden, who is going to pretty much be their second, third safety in that rotation with Derwin James and Alohi Gilman. They really liked using that trio last year. A lot of teams, depending on, use 2 safeties. The Chargers really liked using all 3 of them in Jesse Minter's defense. All 3 of them combined played, I think, 2,400 snaps last year. And that was even with Alohi Gilman missing some time due to injury. And so I think the real question is kind of the quarterback spots. Those are probably the most concerning, not concerning, but the piece of the secondary to figure out. They had Cam Hart, who I think figures to be probably one of your outside corners. They have Tarheeb Still, who will either start on the outside or in the slot, both rookie corners who had really good seasons, especially Still. And then I think the concern is, okay, Christian Fulton and Asante Samuel Jr. both free agents. Do they want to bring either one of those guys back? How expensive are they going to be to bring them one of them back? And then, or do they want to go another direction in that for that second outside corner spot entirely? Could be through free agency, could be through the draft. But I think that is kind of the spot to figure out right now.
So right now, things look a little set where, like you said, with signing Molden, you got the 3 rotations at safety. Still and Hart are going to start, and that leaves one spot. Do you think it's going to be Samuel or Fulton, or do you think it could be both Samuel and Fulton out and someone new in?
I think it could be both of them out. You could also bring back Fulton, I think, on a pretty reasonable deal if they just kind of wanted to have him on like a stopgap contract. I think Asante Samuel Jr.'s market is probably a little bit more than they're willing to pay given his age. And I think given how he fell out of the rotation, not fell out of the rotation, but he was injured. I don't think he's necessarily the kind of player that they envision on the outside. I think they like having a little bit more size at corner. The tackling has always been a little bit of a concern in this particular defensive scheme. If I had to guess, I think they kind of move on from both. I think Fulton, with how he played, at least as a tackler, the coverage is a little hit or miss, but I think with at least how he was as a tackler, could still fit back into the defense if maybe they strike out in free agency, they don't quite get what they want at corner in the draft, then I think there's always kind of room for him and to negotiate and come back. But I would guess right now, if I had to, that both walk, but it also depends on kind of what the free agent market is, both for the Chargers. If there's an external guy there, like if there isn't, then you can open up roads, I think, to them coming back.
Okay. Linebacker. So we've got Dye, we got Perryman, and we'll just start at that spot there. So Perryman, what's the deal there? Do they like his run blocking, veteran kind of deal? Because they got the money. You think they're going to bring him back? And or did Coulson do enough where they feel Coulson and Henley should be the duo starting next year?
Yeah, Perriman is in a weird spot because I think in theory they would like to bring him back, but he is going on, I believe, in his 33 season next year, if I'm correct. Did finish the season, unfortunately, with a few injuries after week 12. Struggled to kind of get back on the field. He did get back for the Texans game and then had to leave in the first half again due to kind of an injury situation. So I think he's in theory a player they'd like to have back. Not quite sure what his market's going to be kind of at his age. And I think there is, with how Deion Henley played last year, really at a Pro Bowl caliber level, even though he wasn't necessarily named a Pro Bowler, I think they're very comfortable moving forward with him. And I think with where they drafted Junior Coulson last year, like you mentioned, there is high expectation in the building for what he should be able to do defensively and the step he'll take next year. He did have a bit of an injury situation this year during the season and then missed a lot of the training camp kind of onboarding process because he had to have an appendectomy in the offseason last year. So I think their hope is, injury-free offseason, kind of get dialed in, obviously, a little bit more into the playbook and everything than he was with the offseason he had last year. And then, I do think Deion is clearly the starter there. I think they want to work Coulson kind of into one of those spots and then fill in the linebacker spots kind of around those two, sort of like you mentioned. And then Perriman, like you said, I think could come back, might not. Maybe there's a role for him elsewhere, but I do think they're probably at least wary of kind of the injury situation, but kind of depends on how expensive he is to bring back.
So Henley was somebody that they really liked the way that he advanced in year 2.
Yeah, I mean, he was a couple votes off from being like a second-team All-Pro last year. This is a guy who was, really impressive, both in coverage ability as a tackler. I think he did everything that they asked for him to do kind of at linebacker, took a really big jump from year one, where he kind of played more of a special teams role, to being able to kind of be that starting Mike do-it-all linebacker for them. So I think he's absolutely part of the future plans, and then they'll kind of build out that linebacker room around him while he's in the last 2 years of his rookie deal starting this year.
Edge. So what's the latest on Mac? I don't think anybody expected the 17 sacks in 23 at his age, but he's still, a very talented player, and he had at least one really big season left in the tank. So it wasn't surprising that his production came down a little bit this season as he's getting older. Is he in their plans? Are they going to try to bring him back? Veteran, that kind of deal? Or is he expendable?
I think they will try to bring him back. I think it'll be a competitive process to bring him back, though. I do think we'll see what happens if they try to extend him before the offseason kicks off. But I do think he is, this is possibly his very last 1, maybe 2 years in the league. And so I do think he'll probably want to see at least what's out there in free agency. If there's a chance to join a contender, maybe that's a little further along in the Chargers, like a Buffalo, like a Baltimore, somewhere like that. I think he'll look into that. I think obviously the Chargers really want him to be back, even with the dip in pass rush production. Still highly effective as a pass rusher, and still a very, very elite run defender. I think their intent is to bring him back, but I think there's a lot of ways, obviously, that can go with him testing free agency, as well as his running mate in Joey Bosa having a $36 million cap hit, despite a lot of injuries over the last number of years that have kind of racked up. And, a situation there, Bosa took a pay cut last year to stay. Mac did as well. So, does he take another pay cut? Do the Chargers just decide to kind of move on from Bosa due to the injuries and all that? I think those two also have been, pretty tight on and off the field. So is there a connection? If one leaves, does the other? I think the edge room could go any number of ways, whether on defense. I think that's definitely the most contested spot as far as, is it a total rebuild? Is Mac back? Are both gone? Are both back? I think that's probably the most contentious up in the air spot on defense.
So Bosa is someone that if he's gone, is that due to a cut and they'll just eat the money, and is that affordable, or more likely a trade? How do you see that happening if he's not with the team?
I tend to think it'll be through a cut. So Joey Bosa's cap hit, like I mentioned, is $36 million this year, and basically a lot of that is non-guaranteed money. Okay. I think he has a $12 million roster bonus if he is on the team come the third day of the league year, or something like that. But essentially, the Chargers can save $25 million by moving off of Bosa this year with a direct cut. So it is very financially advantageous for them to cut him, but kind of like the position they were in last year. Is there an alternative where they ask him to take a pay cut, sure, but he gets to keep some portion of his, guaranteed money? Is he willing to do that a second year in a row? Right. So there's a lot on his end as well. Or do they just kind of rip the Band-Aid off there and go a different direction at edge? Because I do think Bosa, when he is healthy, there is a great player there.
Yep.
As we saw in week 1, parts of week 2 last season. It's just that, the complications have been hip injuries, a number of injuries throughout the years that I think have really prevented him from being the Joey Bosa of 2019, 2020, when he was, that level of player. And, he does turn 30, I think, this year. So I think all things that they kind of consider with Bosa. So I don't think that chapter is completely closed, but I think you look at their financial opportunity to, kind of build the team out and get out of that contract. And I would personally, if I'm running the team type thing here, but I do think you kind of move on from him this offseason.
Okay. So basically, this is their opportunity to do
Yeah.
that, and that would be next month.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
You're talking about settling this sometime before free agency in March.
Okay. Interesting. So that would leave him with one edge rusher. If they go Bosa Mac on, then
Right.
that
If
becomes
they
a big
go,
need. Yeah.
yeah, then it becomes, yeah, kind of like you said, a big need. Do they explore free agency or, leave it to the draft, right? They still have Thule, who's on this chart, and they still have Bud Dupree. But, obviously the big points of the discussion this offseason will be on those top two with Mac and Bosa.
Okay. In the middle of that defense, up front, actually on the defensive line, you've got Fox, Ford, and Tart. They're all free agents. Pord, of course, had a monster season from day one. It was just amazing how he broke out in that first game and then just never looked back. Tart also played well. Fox is just a depth guy, a piece. So how do you think they're gonna look at free agency here? I'm assuming they want to bring Ford back.
Yeah, I think the intent is to bring Ford back for sure. I think Tart was really impressive, at least in the snaps that he had this season once he came over from Miami in the middle of the year. So I think they would like to bring both those guys back. Depends on kind of what the deals are and the money obviously, but bring those guys back, and then we'll see if there's other options that they pursue in free agency as well. I do think they are a team that probably could use bringing in another true pass rusher type a little bit, even if you do bring Ford and Tart back. Obviously, the belle of the free agent ball to some degree is Milton Williams, who is going to get a big payday from Philadelphia. So, do they kind of look at the market in addition to bringing those two back? I do think they need a little bit more of a pass rush presence on the interior, in addition to what Ford and Tart have done, which is really good. But I do think whether it's through the draft and using, Kenneth Grant from Michigan is an option there, or in free agency, I do think they'll be pretty aggressive at D tackle.
Yeah, this is going to be a very deep class for defensive tackles. And if you want a defensive tackle or just some linemen up front that can play the 3-4, this is definitely a draft for that. Okay, so let's now move on to the offensive side. And we'll start with Dobbins. So with his injury history, do you suspect that they'll bring him back, on the cheap, or are they going to let him go explore? And then if somebody wants to give him a deal that they don't want to counter, that they'll be fine with that, or do they just want to let him go altogether?
I think they bring him back. I mean, he was a pretty highly productive, player this year for the deal he was on. He was on something like 50,000 guaranteed, and everything else was paid in incentives based off of the injury history and the stuff he came off of. Ended up having over 900 yards. I think he's a guy that definitely fits in the system of what Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh want out of their run game. I think the question is kind of what do they do with Gus Edwards, who underperformed this year and is a cuttable salary, hypothetically, if they want to go that way. And then I do think Dobbins is back, both due to they want him back, as well as I don't think the market is necessarily going to be big for any of the running backs this year, particularly just because of the strength of the running back draft class.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that their move is probably bring back Dobbins and then explore the draft at the running back position.
Okay.
Whether that's early on, round 4, round 5 of the draft, wherever it is, I do think they'll take one or potentially, multiple running backs in a really stacked class. And with as many picks as they do have 10 picks to work with.
All right. Let's see. Let's go to wide receiver. And we have 4 free agents, really only one that played a prominent role. Now, of course, was Josh Palmer. Do you think it's time for a clean slate as far as all 4 of them, including Palmer, let them go? Or is there a specific player here that the Chargers would like to see back?
I think you probably let them go at this point. Palmer is a guy that I think with his chemistry with Herbert, with how long he's been playing with him, if you strike out on your other options in free agency, I could see them coming back to the Palmer table, if you will. But I do think, based off of what we've heard in terms of reporting, I do think there'll be an active player in both wide receiver free agency and potential trade market scenarios, right? They've been linked to a trade for potentially DK Metcalf, T. Higgins. Let's see if the Bengals franchise tag him. Devontae Adams has been rumored to want to come back to California specifically. So I think those are all, top tier options you consider. And then there's a number of other names in the free agent wide receiver market. But Palmer, I think, is one of those guys who's not going to go particularly early in free agency. So I do think the Chargers, should they want to, can kind of circle back in the later weeks of free agency and say, hey, we didn't get what we wanted. Maybe we want you back, or we want you back in a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 type role instead of, what he's been the last couple of years, or last year specifically, which was more their wide receiver 1 or 2. So I think they have some flexibility with what they can do there with Palmer, depending on how free agency goes for them.
Okay. I know Rice was injured most of the season, so
Yeah.
Are they still looking at him as hopefully a player that could make the team next year?
Yeah, I think they look at him as a player that can potentially do that. Obviously, a lot of that will be training camp competition type stuff, but he'll definitely be, wide receiver 6, 7, competing for one of those spots, depending on obviously how many receivers do they bring in via the draft and free agency. But he'll have, I think, the license to compete for one of those spots for sure.
Hurst, free agent. I would assume he's probably gone. Smart, of course, he came out of nowhere, finally getting the opportunity to play a little bit after, I guess, learning how to play the game in the NFL. And he's a restricted free agent. But what do you think? You think Smart's back, Hurst not?
Yeah, I think Smart's back, especially because they have his restricted free agent rights. I don't think he's necessarily going to get a crazy offer in free agency. Yeah. So I think they do bring him back. Hurst was someone that I think they expected more from in terms of the pass catching role, while they had Disley do a lot of the blocking. Hurst was unfortunately injured a lot of the year, and just kind of didn't pan out when he did play in terms of the way that they wanted as kind of the rebound projects. They took a bunch of those kind of minimum contract bets last year. And so I do think that they move on at this stage, and this is a tight end class in the draft that's obviously pretty good.
Yeah.
As well as if you want to make a move in free agency. So I do think they probably clean house here, at least as far as Hurst is concerned.
All right, offensive line. The big one is Bowman down the middle. He replaced Lindsley, and Bozeman has just been average at best center. So you think this is one of those situations where the Chargers will just move on, try to upgrade that position with a veteran, or maybe even through the draft, or I don't know. You tell me. What do you think they need to do here with Bozeman?
I think they look to upgrade the position for sure. By what means they're willing to do that, right? It depends on kind of how much they're willing to spend in free agency. Obviously, I think that's the primary outlet of which you would upgrade the center position. But I think they also probably will look to upgrade right guard. Trey Pipkins is a cuttable salary this year. They save about $6.75 million by cutting Pipkins.
And you think that'll happen?
Yes, I do think that'll happen, because unfortunately his salary right now is construed in a way where he's kind of, if he's not going to be starting, then he kind of makes too much to be like a swing tackle guard type player. That would be just the backup. So I do think he probably is moved on from, and I think they look to upgrade probably for sure right guard, and then center. Bozeman is a guy I think they can kind of circle back to if they're unable to maybe upgrade that position in free agency, but I do expect them to upgrade on that center spot for sure. The other alternative is like you bring Bozeman back on a 1-year deal and draft a center.
And draft one, yeah.
But I do expect them to be players for one in free agency.
Okay. So before we move on to top needs overall, you mentioned Pipkins. So let me see. We got Bosa as a possible cap casualty. Pipkins. You mentioned Gus Edwards. What about Bud Dupree? Are they happy with Bud Dupree enough? I believe they could save $3 million if they let him go. Or is that also going to have a lot to
Yeah.
depend on what they do with Mac and Bosa?
Depending on what they do with Mac and Bosa, I think, because I think in theory you can free up some money there, but they don't necessarily need to. And Mac and Bosa both leave, then Bud
Yeah,
Dupree
then yeah.
becomes your edge two on the roster, where
Yeah.
they'll look to add in free agency and stuff like that. So I think for what he does on the roster right now is that kind of fourth rotational edge player. Like his salary is kind of fine, and they have enough money anyway. So I think they're going to see what happens with Mac and Bosa first before they act on stuff like that.
Okay. What about let's go to I tell you what, before we go to the top needs, were there any interesting, notable coaching changes from the staff?
No, I mean the staff is largely back in place. I think their safeties coach Chris O'Leary took a college DC job, I think at Western Michigan. So they replaced him with the coach from Florida State. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But that was really the only notable change, was that safeties coach spot. Outside of that, they're running it back with Jesse Minter, who didn't get any head coach interviews this year, and then Greg Roman is obviously back at offensive coordinator, so they're keeping their main trio of their staff together with Harbaugh, Roman, and Minter.
Okay, let's go into needs. Top needs. Have you had time to put together like an actual list 1 through 5, or you just know what the needs are? And
I didn't have time to put together a list, but I could just blurt out positions.
Let's do it, and then we'll figure it out. We'll do it. We'll do it on the show. We'll do it live, recorded. So let's start with. Go ahead, spit out some needs on offense first.
Yeah, I think you're definitely looking to add a receiver. That is, their weakness in the playoffs, I think, was really shown by not having a reliable X target. They've been linked to a number of the big money free agents, kind of like I mentioned earlier, or trade targets. To me, that is probably the biggest need on offense, and I think the area where they lack the most compared to a lot of Super Bowl contenders. And then I think your other two big needs on offense, where you kind of wait to see how they play it out, is center and right guard. Tight end they can add in the draft, but I would say the three biggest needs on offense right now are wide receiver, center, and right guard, in terms of how quickly they try to address those positions once free agency particular gets here in March.
Okay. Defense, well, we know edge. That's for sure.
Yeah, edge with Mac being a free agent, obviously, and depending on how they play out the Bosa situation. So, that could be a bigger need come draft time if they bring both back. In theory, it's not a need, but I do think this is probably the offseason where they change. And then I think D tackle is a big one too. Obviously, bringing back Puna Ford and Tierra Tart, I think would be great, but I do think they need more than that, whether that comes in the draft, whether that comes in free agency with kind of a star pass rusher type. I do think they need more at that DT position. So I would say primarily the biggest need on offense is on defense is edge as well as defensive tackle right now.
And if they want like a penetrator, do you know, knowing what they look for, do they look for like an undersized guy? Do they need a bigger guy? Like I know Peebles is about 290. He's an interior penetrator type. Or are they going to look for someone a little bit bigger that also can rush the passer?
I think it depends on what's available to them.
Okay.
Kenneth Grant obviously fits the mold of someone who's like super big, super athletic. But I think it depends on kind of in the draft what falls to them, as well as how active they are in free agency. Do they want to spend a lot of money on that position, or are they kind of reserving it more for the offensive spending? Because I could see DT being a position that they kind of splurge at in the offseason, but I do think they'll probably address the offensive side of the ball from a financial standpoint more.
And then in the secondary, do they need to go out and get, like you said, a corner, specifically like a bigger corner, more physical corner?
I think it'll be something that they ideally want to do. Like I said, I think they address some of the other positions of need first on defense, being edge room and defensive tackle. But I do think they're flexible with what they want to add in that corner spot. I don't know if they're going to necessarily pay for like a top of the line corner, but I do think they ideally want to get one of those more physical outside boundary corners that they can just rely on and not have to, necessarily draft a corner super high come April. So I think they'd like to stabilize that position, right now in free agency.
Okay, let's talk then about, and maybe we could even figure out a way to rank these, but talk about free agency first. So you've already mentioned a couple of receivers, and you mentioned one defensive tackle. Can you mention anybody else specifically that you think they'll target at these positions?
Yeah, I think you can look at the offensive line in particular. Drew Dahlman is a highly, touted center prospect, probably going to cost a lot of money. They have been linked to somebody like Will Fries at right guard, who I think is kind of a more budget option than say like a Trey Smith, who will be like really expensive, but they could also, look to go in that direction in theory. But I think there's kind of a difference between the, top line right guard candidates versus like people who can kind of stabilize them. Ryan Kelly from Indianapolis, the center, is another name I expect them to maybe circle back to, depending on if they want a top of the market line guy or somebody more in his tier. But I do think those are a couple names on the offensive line that they could end up targeting.
Okay. And how about on the edge? Because I know there are some big name edge guys out there. Have the Chargers been linked to any of those superstar type edge rushers yet?
I wouldn't say explicitly linked to any of them. Linked to Khalil Mack, who will command a lot of money in free agency, obviously. But right now, I wouldn't say they're linked to any names in particular. But obviously, if you potentially lose Mack and Bosa, I think some of them that could appeal are like a Baron Browning type. You have Josh Sweat, who's coming off of a great playoff run with the Eagles. DeMarcus Lawrence is another potential kind of name there. So those are just a few kind of the names. But obviously, if you lose Mack and or Bosa, depending on if they lose one or two of them, then I think it probably becomes a pretty big deal to add one of those big money edge rusher types that can fill some snaps for them this season. But we'll see how that plays out.
All right. So let's see. It sounds to me from what you're saying is that if you had to break down like the top need, you would be battling between the interior offensive line, defensive tackle, edge rusher, and wide receiver. Those would be the four that would be battling for the top spot, right?
Yeah, I'd probably say wide receiver is kind of the biggest need. If I had to rank them, wide receiver 1, edge 2, interior offensive line 3, and then I think DT fills in that 4th spot. And then you can obviously split
tight end.
Tight end is in there, and then I think interior offensive line you can obviously split into center and right guard needs specifically. But yeah, so I think that's probably a good indication of like your 1 through 5.
So I know doing some of these mock drafts, there's an awful lot of speculation about, you got the Michigan ties. You mentioned one of them at defensive tackle. So if Colston Loveland were available, even though you think that tight end might be a little bit further down the pecking order, but look, a lot of it's possible that they take care of this stuff in free agency. And then all of a sudden, tight end can go from the 5th to a little bit further up the board. But what do you think about that possibility? And are there any others? Would you put Loveland up there with Grant as two of the more prominent ex-Harbaugh guys that he might want to target?
Yeah, I put them both there. Unfortunately, I think Kenneth Grant's probably going to test really well at the combine, and then I think he'll be probably
he ain't
out.
going to be available. No.
Yeah, I don't think he is. Loveland, I think, is a possibility, depending on how the draft plays out. But I think you're really looking at defensive tackle. Tight end is possible there, depending on if Loveland's there, but then the value is not great. They could look at running back. Obviously, I think Genty will be off the board before then, but then you have your kind of Omarion Hampton, Caleb Johnson, tier of guys that they could potentially take there and sort of establish the run. And, if they're not as aggressive in addressing the offensive line in free agency, maybe, then you could look at like a Tyler Booker potentially, in that range as well, and addressing the interior offensive line. So a lot of time between now and the draft, but I do think they look at those positions in particular, just sort of the biggest needs on their team, and take whoever kind of best player available on their board is by the time they're around there. Not quite as, maybe big as it was last year you kind of knew their pick last year was right tackle or wide receiver, depending on how the alt versus receiver debate played out. But this year, I think there's a little bit more flexibility with how far they are down the board compared to last year, as well as, how many needs they have. I don't know if there's one guy you can just peg there specifically.
Well, we do know this. It is also a very deep class for tight ends. Yeah. And there's just no doubt that he's going to land a tight end. It's just going to depend on where. So, And if Loveland isn't there, because I think if Loveland could go to the Saints. It's very possible. And, but it's also possibly still there. Okay. So, by the way, are they looking for, you mentioned like corner, bigger physical guy. Are they looking for a specific brand of interior lineman?
I wouldn't say a specific brand. I would just say they probably are, for offensive line or defensive line?
Offensive line. They want a more tougher physical guy or a more athletic guy?
I'd say either. I really think they're just kind of looking for an upgrade over their current guys there with Bradley.
So they're not pigeonholed into a specific.
Yeah, they're not pigeonholed. I think they like someone a little bit more maybe athletic than Bozeman, but I think they're just kind of looking for stable upgrade who could kind of stabilize that side of the line. Because I think Bozeman was brought in here to be a great fit for a year. And they were in a bad financial position last year, so they gave guys a bunch of like 1 year small contracts to kind of see how it went. But I think now that you are back in the conversation of being a playoff team, we saw how abused they got by the Texans defensive line. Like that is something that going forward, if you want to be a championship contender,
right?
We see with Philadelphia, as we see with a lot of these teams, like you just have to have the offensive line to be able to compete. Otherwise, you're going home early.
Okay. Lastly, are there any players, young players on the roster that you think might be ready to take that next step? That maybe fans outside of Chargers land, they don't really follow the team. Someone that might be could have been a college free agent last year. It could be a second-year guy ready to take another move that may fill a spot that we're not thinking about.
Yeah, I think Kamani Vidal is a guy that they are decently high on. Obviously didn't get a bunch of chance to play last year after Dobbins was, the main bell count. Then they had Edwards kind of at their RB2. Didn't get a ton of reps to play, but I think he's someone that they're still pretty decently high on.
And that can make Edwards even more expendable.
Potentially. Obviously the salary's there too.
Yep.
Edwards was older, was more injured. So I think that's something that they could look at depending on if they cut Edwards or not. I think that's still kind of a debate there. And then I think on I'd say young guy on the defensive side of the ball, you are like you mentioned with Junior Colson. I think that's someone that they definitely expect to take a step forward this year, having more normal offseason. And hopefully healthy. And then I think Cam Hart, probably another guy that, obviously came in and played a bunch of starter snaps at the end of last year, but obviously very different going into a season, knowing you could, probably start at one of those outside spots. So I would mention him in that capacity too, taking a big role step forward.
And other than that, there were no like, 6th or 7th round guys or college free agents that caught your eye or you think caught their eye.
Uh, Not right now. I mean, I think there's
Okay.
guys on the practice squad, and like you mentioned, Brendan Rice and a couple others that will like compete for roster spots, but not necessarily like right now they're breakout
Okay.
candidates.
And by the way, J.K. Scott, did they bring him back?
I think they do. I think that's a position where you could bring him back and then not take a punter in the draft, but sign a punter in like undrafted free agency, something like that, and bring in a guy to compete with J.K. Scott. But outside of that, I don't think they touch the special teams room much at all.
They had a good year.
Yeah, Cameron Dicker, I think he was extended last offseason, still hitting at a high percentage, and Josh Harris is their long snapper. So I don't think they touch much out there outside of potentially bringing in some competition for J.K. Scott.
Excellent, Alex. Thank you very much. So what are you working on? Anything in particular right now? I know it's all draft related, but like combine stuff or?
Yeah. Combine stuff. I mean, the people who are there in Indy will probably be covering it for us. I'm not in Indy, I'm at school, but I will be doing, free agency stuff leading up to the next, 3 weeks when free agency gets going. Still doing previews of, players they could target and, receivers they need and stuff like that. So you can catch that on the YouTube channel, Guilty as Charged. We'll be doing that over there. And then, I'll still be writing articles.
And you go to Rutgers, right?
I graduated from Rutgers.
You graduated from Rutgers.
Yeah. So I'm in med school now. So
still in medical school.
Yeah.
Okay. And is that New Jersey?
No. I'm in Antigua. So American University of Antigua in the Caribbean.
Oh,
so yeah,
that's cool.
Little off the map.
That's adventurous.
Adventurous, yeah.
That's a nice way of putting it. But yeah,
I'm all the way out there. So yeah.
Very cool. That's exciting. Glad to hear that. I really appreciate the time, Alex. And unless something really big happens, you probably won't hear from me until after the draft, and then maybe we'll get an opportunity at that point to take a look at how the offseason went for the team.
Anytime. I'd love to be back.
I appreciate that, and say hello to all the girls that are on the beach while you're studying. And
will do.
And I'll talk to you real soon. Thanks, Alex.
Talk to you soon.